Greetings, everyone. Welcome. Today is day 16 of 20 of the big read of the wonderful work, Solving the Race Issue in America. Thank you for returning, for joining us once again for another intense, interesting read and a wonderful discussion to follow. And for those of you who were unable to join us live, we hope that you enjoy the video recording of this as you're observing this, ideally in sequence, so that you can follow us along in the text. Dr. Harris, how are you today?
I am incredibly great today.
Excellent. We have a magnificent, a brilliant young readers with us today, Janet North Cabore. How are you?
Hi. Hi, how
Excellent.
are you?
We are well, and we are so grateful that you're joining us for the big read. Dr. Harris, it's your pleasure. I can introduce Ms. Cabore, who I'm just going to do it. You're so impressive. I'm doing it now. Janet North Cabore joins us from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, School of Nursing and Global Health. Right in the middle of a health pandemic, she's taking the time out as a frontline responder to join us. Thank you. Where she's a program manager for the Global Learning to Advance Health Equity Network project, a project that seeks to encourage global bidirectional learning with a focus on advancing health equity. That we need that right now. Over the past 6 years, she's worked on various projects, both academic and federal, seeking to eliminate inequities in environmental, technological, and social communities experienced by vulnerable population. She received her bachelor's degree from the Coppin State University and her master's degree in public health from the University of New England. Janet has also written several plays because she is passionate about the blending of the sciences and the arts. Her passion is reflected in her community-centered youth program, Empowering Communities Block by Block, which teaches youth about the importance of data, information, and how to leverage data to obtain desperately needed resources in their communities. Empowering Communities Block by Block imparts knowledge in the areas of data research, health, physical and mental health, civic responsibility, emergency preparedness, various creative platforms, and provide youth with tools such as CPR, first aid, mental health, aid dissemination skills, and community-based participatory research that they need in order to be strong leaders in their community as well as in their families. Janet's motto for Empowerment Communities Block by Block and personal mantra is inspiring minds and challenging potentials by integrating disciplines. We are so pleased to have you with us here as a multi-disciplined person. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the honor to be of the invitation. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Harris, would you like to catch us up or remind us of what we covered in our last discussion, and then we can simply jump into the reading.
Yes, Dr. Rogers, but first I want to just thank Janet for being here. And as I was listening to Dr. Rogers read your impressive resume, you know, I love it when people can unite the sciences. Knowledge is all one big phrase. You know, we have a tendency to want to break it up into different areas, but it takes a very special mind to integrate it all together and literally apply principles from one area to another area to bring about a much more insightful outcome. So thank you so much. We appreciate you. Wow, we're looking forward to your reading today.
Thank you.
Now, just bringing us up to date, we're in the week number 4. This is class number 16 of our big read of Solving the Race Issue in America. And we're beginning this week coming down those hard truths. For the last day, we've been dealing with the idea of making of a slave. Everywhere, everything that we learn about racism in America, about the American experience, from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War, through Jim Crow through the present, has really had a root cause on this really tragic emotional and physical experience called slavery. And so we've chosen in our book, Solving the Race Issue in America, to delve into it probably in more detail than some other publications, because we have to realize the depth and extent of this institution and how it has impacted Black Americans and white Americans. And when we see how deep it is on a very personal level, we can see why now, 300 years, 400 years after 1619, why over 150 years after the Civil War, we are still grappling with the issue of racism in America. And so this is the context in which we began our reading today. We've been in the passage on the making of a slave. And in our last session, we talked about some of the most, I mean, it was heart-wrenching. It was not only hard to hear it, it was hard to read it. And as we learned in our discussion with our participants, it was hard to hear it. And so we're picking up now. We had talked about the cardinal principle for making a Negro, and really a Negro slave. And so today we want to pick up on that with the breaking process of the African woman. And so Janet, we'll go right on with you. And thank you so much for your powerful reading.
Thank you again for inviting me to be here. So beginning with the breaking process of the African woman. Take the female and run a series of tests on her to see if she will submit to you your desires willingly. Test her in every way, because she is the most important factor for good economic. If she shows any signs of resistance in submitting completely to your will, do not hesitate to use the bullwhip on her to extract the last bit of B out of her. Take care not to kill her, for in doing so, you spoil good economics. When in complete submission, she will train her offspring in the early years to submit to labor when they become of age. Understanding is the best thing. Therefore, we shall go deeper into this area of the subject matter concerning what we have produced here in the breaking of the female Negro. We have reversed the relationship. In her natural, uncivilized state, she would have a strong dependence on the uncivilized Negro male, and she would have a limited protective dependence towards her independent male offsprings, and would raise female offspring to be dependent like her. Nature had provided for this type of balance. We reversed nature by burning and pulling one civilized Negro apart and bullwhipping the other to the point of death, all in her presence. By her being left alone, unprotected, with male image destroyed, the ordeal caused her to move from her psychological dependent state to a frozen, independent state. In this frozen psychological state of independence, she will raise her male and female offspring in reversed roles. For fear of the young male's life, she will psychologically train him to be mentally weak and dependent, but physically strong. Because she has become psychologically independent, she will train her female offspring to be psychologically independent as well. What have you got? You've got the Negro woman out front and the Negro man behind and scared. This is the perfect situation for sound sleep in economics. Before the breaking process, we had to be alert and on guard at all times. Now we can sleep soundly, for out of frozen fear, his woman stands guard for us. He cannot get past her early infant slave molding process. He is a good tool, now ready to be tied to the horse at a tender age. By the time the Negro boy reaches the age of 16, he is soundly broken in and ready for a long life of sound and efficient work and the reproduction of a unit of good labor force. Continually, through the breaking of uncivilized savage Negroes, by throwing the Negro female savage into a frozen psychological state of independency, by killing the protective male image, and by creating a submissive, dependent mind of the Negro male slave, we have created an orbiting cycle that turns on its own axis forever, unless a phenomenon occurs and reshifts the positions of the male and female savages. The breeding process. We show what we mean by example. We breed two Negro males with two Negro females. Then when we take the Negro male away from them and keep them moving and working. Say the Negro female bear a Negro female and the other bears a Negro male. Both Negro females, being without influence of the Negro male image, frozen with an independent psychology, will raise him to be mentally dependent and weak, but physically strong. In other words, body over mind. We will mate and breed them and continue the cycle. That is good, sound, and long-range comprehensive planning.
Wow. Dr. Rogers?
I was simply going to ask you your thoughts on the reading, Dr. Harris. I still have to absorb, and they say sometimes we chuckle when we're angry. We chuckle when we're upset, and it's an upsetting read. It's an upsetting process, and I'll respond a little later, but I'd just like to hear from you at this time.
Well, Doc and Janet, thank you so much for reading it. And as I read it, as I listen to the words, there's something about the vibration that the spoken word gives to the written word. You can read it sometimes and it may not touch your spirit, but when you hear it, when you hear the words that are written on the page describe such an intentional process, and I can really see an intentional process. In other words, it was the goal of the slave master to destroy all connection to reality, to destroy the natural protectiveness. On the African continent, before slaves, Africans were brought to this country as slaves, for thousands and thousands of years, Africans had lived and raised families and had cultures and taken care of their children and built pyramids, thousands of years. But this process, this slave-making process, was intended to destroy all of that. And as it says, to create a state of frozen, almost frozen emotion, almost frozen to the point that you don't know where to turn. All of the natural bonds have been broken. The natural bond in Africa of the male to protect his family and his children, that's broken. And the key is always, as he said, the female, because the female is the gateway to the next generation. The goal was to have the female slave become so frozen in psychology and in emotion that she would then transfer that to her children, to the male and to the female, recreating this frozen state that the master had induced by this terrible, terrible process. And so it really, when we look at where we are, a couple of things. It's a rough read, but I think it's important for everybody, for Black people and white people, to know how this came about, how this took place, to know the capacity of human beings. I mean, we look at it and we say, did anybody have a Bible? Had anybody read the Golden Rule? Did anybody give one thought for do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Frederick Douglass once said that anybody who thinks that being a slave is not that bad should spend one day as a slave, not a lifetime, not generations, but one day as a slave, and his opinion would change. And so we see this intentional psychological warfare and destruction of a human being, of Africans, of black male and female Africans and their offspring, all for, as the word said, all for good economics. that it was dehumanizing for the purpose of good economics, because it is only when you can dehumanize a person to this point where they are totally frozen in consciousness that they become useful to the master as an economic vehicle,
as a tool. And what's interesting, Dr. Harris, is you spoke of this earlier. Oh, I'm sorry. I have something to say, but I'll just speak briefly to this and then go to Ms. Cabore. The notion that the person in prison and the prison guard are both in prison. So the people that did these despicable acts, they in fact were subjected themselves to that as well. And it may play out later in their culture, but we see some of these same things happening in the larger dominant culture currently that were practiced then. Ms. Cabore, would you care to respond to the reading and, you know, what your thoughts are as a result of the reading, and as well as the response of Dr. Harris?
So for me, it is a difficult read, um, even for in this day, to see how the things that were done so long ago still play front and center to our communities today. Um, just even with the noticing how African American women were always perceived as strong Black women, and that's great. But sometimes, can I be weak and be able to lean on, you know, the strong Black man for a minute? So that kind of struck out to, for me as well. Just, you've got the Negro woman out front of the Negro man, being behind and scared. And then, and as raising a son, how you're always in fear of that son being caught up in some situation that you don't want him to be in. So you're always in fearful for that. So it's still now. And but one thing that really struck me too on the other end is the statement where it says, unless a phenomenon occurs and reshifts the positions. So I would hope that in my lifetime that I see this reshifting. Um, that gives me hope.
Excellent. And I think that, you know, we can't address the problem unless we face it. And it's a tough face, but in facing it, there have been authors, Naim Akbar, Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery, that spoke to this point, Dr. Harris, of the continuation psychologically of some of the, trauma that was experienced in enslavement. And he does give some ways to move out of it. And he celebrates families that are whole. He celebrates where, just as Ms. Cabore said, scenario, this has been analyzed and dealt with, and the roles have been reversed back to their natural state that you spoke of prior to interaction with Europeans.
Yes, Doc, it is. And, as Ms. Cabora, as you were sharing that point about that continuous transformation, that unless something is done to change it. And I think that gives us insight into where we are right now as a country. When we talked about the idea that for the slave master to perpetrate this upon the slave holds them both at a point in time and space. The perpetrator and the victim are both at that same point in time and space. And so as we progress that to the future, to the present, we can see now how this mindset that is created. So it's understandable to see why you have a Ku Klux Klan. It's understandable to see why you have a white supremacist movement, because this is a carryover, present day manifestation of that slave master mentality. But it's also understandable to see why we as Black men and women are in a position that we're in, because the lesson of the slave master in many instances has not been reversed. And the interesting point about how the world responds to it, the slave master mentality, a paradigm, creates a dependence of the Black male, a survival dependence of the Black male, and a dependence of the Black female on the master. And so then we progress to the present, and we have that same white institutional structure now blaming the Black female and the Black male for not having these characteristics that they value, you know, the family core, the relationship. Many of us have survived it and have been able to thrive through it. But still, it is a phenomenon that has not been totally addressed. And when we look at this core situation, we can see how every nationality can come to America, and within 50 to 75 years, they can get ahead of the Black man. I don't care what country you come from, that you can come to this country as poor as Jack's mouse, field mouse. But over 50 to 75 years, you get ahead of Black people. I mean, you look at a town, we're in North Carolina right now, and Black folks have been here since the very beginning. But you'll have just in the area of business, just looking at it, we'll have 5 really good first class Hispanic restaurants and 0 Black restaurants. See, well, why is that? But there's a systemic thing happening because this dependent behavior has never really been addressed in you might say, in a massive manner. Now, I'm sure that there are many Black folks that will take issue with that. But I think a part of this whole transformation is to recognize the damage that has been done to us, that we have coped for it, we have dealt with it, we've made ways to survive. You know, my father, when I look back as a child, and his way of dealing with it, he was a big strapping Black man who had been a boxer, and I saw him knock a white man out in one punch once when I was a kid. And we sure that he was going to die. But my dad he used humor to disarm people. And so when the white police officer came after this man had said this Black man had hit him and knocked his friend out, the police officer said, oh, that's Herbert. He's a good Negro. He's good. No problem. Herbert, go home. Go on home. Tell the guys, y'all go on your way. So even though we have used these coping mechanisms to deal with, in many instances, the wound is still there.
Yeah, that's a lot. So we'll continue the read then, Dr. Harris?
Yes.
Great. Warning, possible interloping negatives. Earlier, we talked about the non-economic good of the horse and the Negro in their wild or natural state. We talked about the principle of breaking and tying them together for orderly production. Furthermore, we talked about paying particular attention to the female enslaved and her offspring for orderly future planning. Then more recently, we stated that by reversing the positions of the male and female enslaved, we had created an orbiting cycle that turns on its own axis forever, unless phenomenon occurred and reshifted the positions of the male and the female enslaved. Our experts warned us about the possibility of this phenomenon occurring, for they say that the mind has a strong drive to correct and recorrect itself over a period of time if it can touch some substantial original historical base. And they advise us that the best way to deal with phenomenon is to shave off the enslaved's mental history and create a multiplicity of phenomenon or illusions so that each illusion will twirl in its own orbit, something akin to floating balls in a vacuum. This creation of a multiplicity of phenomenon or illusions entails the principles of cross-breeding the Negro and the horse, as we stated above, remember, the purpose of which is to create a diversified division of labor, the result of which is severance of the points of original beginnings for each spherical illusion. Since we felt that the subject matter may get more complicated as we proceeded in laying down our economic plan concerning the purpose, reason, and effect of crossbreeding horses and Negroes, we shall lay down the following definitional terms for future generations. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about a hall of mirrors, Dr. Harris. You use spherical illusion. I'm thinking of a hall of mirrors. Number one, orbiting cycle means a thing turning in a given pattern. Axis means upon which or around which a body turns. Phenomenon means something beyond ordinary conception and inspires awe and wonder. Multiplicity means a great number, much more than one. Sphere means a globe. Crossbreeding a horse means taking a horse and breeding it with a donkey, and you get a dumb, backward donkey, long-headed mule that is not reproductive nor productive by itself. Crossbreeding Negroes means taking so many drops of good white blood and putting them into as many Negro women as possible, varying the drops by the various tone that you want, and then letting them breed with each other until cycle of colors appears you desire. What this means is this: put the Negroes and the horse in a breeding pot, mix some donkeys and some good white blood, and what do you get? You get a multiplicity of colors of donkeys backwards, unusual Negroes running tied to backwards donkeys, long-headed mules, that one productive of itself, the other sterile, the one constant, the other dying. We keep Negro constant, for we may replace the mule for another tool. Both mule and Negro tied to each other, neither knowing where the other came from and neither productive for itself, nor without each other. Wow. Controlled language. Crossbreeding completed. For further severance from their original beginning, we must completely annihilate the mother tongue of both the Negro and the new mule and institute a new language that involves the new life's work of both. You know, language is a peculiar institution. It leads to the heart of people. The more a foreigner knows about the language of another country, the more he or she is able to move through all levels of that society. Therefore, if the foreigner is an enemy of the country, to the extent that he or she knows the body of the language, to that extent is the country vulnerable to attack or invasion of a foreign culture. For example, you take the enslaved. If you teach him or her all about your language, he or she will know all your secrets. And he or she is then no more enslaved, for they can't fool him or her any longer. And having a fool is one of the basic ingredients of an incidents to the making of the slavery system. The end. Wow. You put a lot in that one, Dr. Harris. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
I
There we
thought
go.
my lips were moving.
Your mind too. Your mind was also.
Well, this document was researched, from various sources, and many times I wanted to challenge its authenticity almost. I just did not want to believe it. But you often say biblically, they say you tell the tree by its fruit. And so when I look at the manifestations in the present reality, I see so much of this there. Now I understand. You remember in Roots, there was an insistence on cutting off that connection with the homeland. Remember, Toby insisted on being Kutu Kente, who he knew his name, and he was always trying to run away. Okay. And the master beat him, and literally finally cut a piece of his foot off so he could no longer run. But it was then you see, okay, that is why that was important, because once you cut off a person from their language and make it a death penalty for them to communicate in their own languages. You bring these Africans here from the continent, they had a language before they came here, but by denying and destroying that language, they can no longer communicate with each other. By teaching them your language, you only give them a facility of that language to the point where they are useful. When you read some of the slave narratives, there's a book called Bullwhip Season, and it talks about some of the treatments of slaves during that period of enslavement, and just how when you read the narrative, the language was so broken that it made it very difficult to understand, and that was intentional. That's why they never wanted slaves to learn how to read or write, because the more you can undermine the mode for communication, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, even speaking, then the greater your capacity to keep them isolated and literally frozen in a psychological state where the enslaved person is useful to you. It always goes back to the economics. We claim to be a Christian nation or a God-fearing people, but when we read this, we have to wonder, where is God? How could a person have that kind of evilness in their heart to perpetrate this type of thing on another human being? But it's important that we know, because it happened. It happened. You may dispute some of the little details of it, but it happened. When you look at that book, Bullwhip Days, you see pictures where a black man was beat so badly that his entire back is just one large piece of scar tissue, where there's no portion of his back that is not scar tissue. You have to say, how could a person do that to another human being? That's all I got on that, Doc. I put it together, but when I read it, it's almost like I didn't do it.
Yeah, it's deep. Miss Janet Cabore, would you care to respond to the reading or Dr. Harris's comments?
Yeah, just to the comments of so for me it's not where is God is, to me, is how can you use God's words to justify what you're doing? Like, to me, that's unimaginable on so many levels. Um, it's interesting too, and I agree with you, Dr. Rogers, when you said mirrors, because just the kind of constant twirling and tumbling and interchanging and then throwing in a new ball into the circle as you're whirling around is so disorienting, and not knowing your history and just hearing this part from here and this part from there, and then the mixing to the point where you have no idea. Even today, we have no idea where you're from. You have no idea what your mother language is, could be. Um, And just a little story that I have several friends that come from Africa, and I was out with them one evening, and I was one of two Americans that were with them, and they were speaking in their native tongue. And so the other American female, it was just the two females, myself and the other young lady, and she was highly upset because they were speaking in their native tongue. And she was saying, that's disrespectful, this, that, and the other. Um, and so the guys were apologizing, and they were saying, they asked me, did I feel the same way? And I said, no, I used to feel that way. But I said, I can only imagine what it is to be in a foreign language and to be able to have someone else that speaks your native tongue where you can just speak freely. I said, so I can only imagine how that feels. I said, so no, it no longer offends me. So I welcome you to speak in your native language, you know? So, I just imagine, so when they separate everyone and from different areas, you had no one to speak your native language to. That's so isolating. It's almost like now we're in a pandemic, but luckily we get to talk to each other. Just imagine not being able to speak any kind of words to anyone. That would be terrifying and so depressing.
And that's why, in part, the use of symbols, like there's a church, I want to say in Charleston, South Carolina. Dr. Harris, you may have been there before, as well as yourself, Ms. Cabore, and they said they had so many different ethnic groups of Africans from so many countries that on the church pews, they would put different symbols. So some people would put lines going to the left, lines going to the right. Some people would put a swirl. Some people would put three dots, three dots, three dots, like a triangle. So, in the midst of all of this confusion and these this intentional letter that speaks directly to the mirrors, the continuing to put illusions out instead of allowing people to be in touch with their indigenous culture. There was always an effort to kind of get back to the source. The same way that Dr. Harris is taking us through this work, there's an effort to like really understand, no, this is the scene of a crime. Let's really unpack this crime, and then we can address what needs to happen next. But we got to really deal with the facts, you know. So that's an amazing piece. Dr. Harris, would you care to respond? I can get a little more reading in if we like.
Yes, I can. Yeah, that would be beautiful. I could read a piece if you'd like, whichever you prefer, because it's hard hearing it.
Yeah, well, maybe if you read it and we take the hearing role, then it'll relieve some of the pressure, if you will.
Yes. Well, one thing as a preliminary, many times when I have shared this in groups, there's this certain white people will challenge the authenticity of it. And, say, well, what is the point? What we know that if you put all the pieces of all the different truths together, you can see that this happened, the way, the difference, the nuances, but it happened. And so why can we not just accept that it happened and that it was terrible? Why must we challenge? And that's that manifestation still of the slave master paradigm. The slave master never wants to acknowledge the terrible injustice and issues that he has perpetrated upon the slave.
And it's almost like saying, what illusion? I didn't create an illusion. There is no illusion. What you're looking at is real.
Mm-hmm.
A total denial and an effort to convince you that there's no denial here. It's just, it didn't happen the way you said it happened.
And Doc, one of the reasons I was questioning about including this whole piece in the book, and one reason I did was because if we can't confront it, we can't get by it. And so white people have to confront it. I've spoken to Black groups and some of the young folk, man, they'd never do that to me. Ain't no way, man. No, never, ever, ever. And so it's both sides that it has to be confronted from the white side, from the Black side, from the truth, from America, from all sides. Let me read a little bit.
Look, can I share just one thing?
Yes, go right ahead.
If you can't like you said, if you can't confront what happened historically, then you're not ready to see that it's happening again right now, or it has continued to happen and we're repeating history, and all of this, the same mindset is still here. So if you're not able to see the past, you're still blinded by what's actually happening today, especially in the past several years. What has happened, we're blinded by that, and that's why we have so much extreme division going on right now.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cabore. That was powerful
Great
because
point.
when you were saying that, I was thinking of George Floyd. You know that 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 idea of George Floyd, that a human being could, in front of millions of people, kneel on his knee long enough that he could literally feel his life drain out of him.
And Dr. Harris, I thought of, Eric Gardner and Rodney King, where it was multiple people participating. It
Yes,
wasn't one person, it's like five people, everybody's getting as many licks in as possible. And then they show you the camera and they show you with Rodney King, and they're like, no, that's not what happened.
yeah,
See right there when they're hitting him, they're
yeah,
not hitting him. He's angry. He's on the ground.
yes. He's getting
Wow.
into it. Yeah. And that type of denial, and that's something to our white brothers and sisters, we really have to work with each other to get past that, because as long as you have that type of denial mindset, it stays. If it's not, if it's not a slave being beaten or abused in the field, it's redlining, so that people of African, Black Americans can't get credit. It's kneeling on the knee of a police officer. Just a different mindset. A Black man comes along with even a thought. Remember the fella, Helio Castillo, the guy who was driving his car, told the cops he had a gun, reached to show him his gun permit, and the cop shot him. And so that's that manifestation of that same attitude towards Black people.
And that's just as crazy as the Black Lives Matter. Excuse me. That's just as crazy as the Black Lives Matter movement on Capitol Hill, and
Yeah,
them having as much police as they could, and then the rally that was held on the insurrectionist rally, and them having only a few police officers, and even after that, they can't find the president complicit with these people storming and shooting at folks and deaths happening. It's like, are your eyes covered that much that you can't see that?
and thanks, Doc. And that's why we as Americans, as white and Black Americans, have got to fess up. We've got to do it, because we can see that in 300 and 400 years, it's still there. And cancer will eventually kill the patient. Sooner or later, it kills the patient. And America is too good for that. That when this vision was laid out by our forefathers, it was a God-given vision, a God-given vision given to imperfect people. But we have the capacity to strive for perfection. Let me read a bit. Many different accounts of the slave making process embody the process and procedure outlined by Willie Lynch. As I think back on Alex Haley's TV miniseries Roots, I remember seeing images similar in substance and essence to those described by Willie Lynch. Unruly slaves were beaten within an inch of their lives in front of the slave women and children. The white slave master had his sexual pleasures with the female slaves of his choice. Kutu Kente tried to keep his African name and constantly ran away until the white slave master cut off his foot in front of the other slaves as a barbaric lesson indelibly etched into their own consciousness. The words of Willie Lynch came to life in Haley Garimi's incredible film Sankofa. Every slave making technique described by Lynch and more were vividly portrayed in Sankofa. The words of Willie Lynch helps one understand the meaning, importance, and purpose of the chainings, torture, whippings, rapings, and disembowelment committed in Karima. Sankofa gave vivid meaning to Lynch's technique of taking so many drops of good white blood and putting them into as many Negro women as possible and letting them breed with each other until cycle of colors appears as you desire. The 100th monkey phenomena, our present condition. Let us consider the words of Frederick Douglass and the techniques of Willie Lynch. From the Willie Lynch writing, it is clear to Douglass that the making of a slave was based on the process by which wild animals were domesticated with added components due to the human being's mental, physical, and psychological superiority. The process described by Willie Lynch is essentially the same process, though taken to a far higher, more complex order that scientists use to train or modify the behavior of laboratory rats. It is the same process by which certain monkeys learn to wash their food. In fact, the 100th monkey phenomena applies to the slave-making process, is scientific proof of what Douglass clearly understood, that the slave experience and mentality impacted not only those who felt the master's whip upon his back, or those who experienced the unwanted intrusion of the master's lust within her body. The slave-making experience impacted not only the slave, but also the mentality, psyche, consciousness, and behavior of every Black American. What about the impact of the slave-making process today in the 20th century? The key to the present impact lies in the warning, possible interloping negatives given by Willie Lynch. In this section, Lynch recaps and summarizes the slave-making process, saying, earlier we talked about the non-economic good of the horse and the Negro in their wild and natural state. Translation: a Black man in his natural state, in the state he was in before enslavement by the white man, has no economic good. He is of no economic value to the slave master. What was this natural state of the kidnapped Africans before they were transformed into American slaves? Lynch tells us in his preamble to Making a Slave. First, we need a Black Negro man, a pregnant Negro woman, and her baby Negro boy. We must reduce them from their natural state in nature, whereas nature provides them with the natural capacity to take care of their needs and the needs of their offspring. Translation: the natural state of Black people was the same as the natural state of white people. Nature had provided them with the natural capacity to take care of themselves and the needs of their family. Lynch then laid out the modus operandi and raison d'etre for the slave-making process. We break that natural string of independence from them and thereby create a dependency state so that we may be able to get from them useful production for our business and pleasure. This further affirms the economies. This further reaffirms that economies, financial benefits to certain white people, was the root of slavery. I'm going to read that again. This further reaffirms that economies, financial benefits to certain white people, was the root cause of slavery. Lynch continues, we talked about the principle of breaking and tying them together for orderly production. Translation: the principles and process of domesticating, breaking a horse, an animal, for the benefit of mankind, and of domesticating, breaking a Black man were very similar. At the end of the breaking process, the horse was no longer in its natural state. It was no longer free to live, roam, procreate, and do things that horses do in the natural state. The horse, once broken, could only serve and benefit its master. If by some stroke of fate, the broken horse, and especially its offspring, were released to the wild and returned to its natural state, it would not have the skills to survive. The kidnapped Africans, after they had been domesticated, broken by some Christian white men, became Black African slaves. At the end of this breaking process, the kidnapped African was no longer in his natural state. It was now a Black American slave. This slave was no longer free to live and move about, procreate, and do things that Black men did in their natural state. The slave, once broken, could only serve and benefit its master. Whew. I'm going to stop right there. Any thoughts or feedback?
Yeah, I thought of a couple of things. In the movie, with Kunta Kinte, there was another part in the movie when I think they take the child from them, Kizzy, and he picks up sand from the soil, and he says, this means that she will return unto us one day. And that was again one of those things that he would have done in his natural culture, but at the moment, his wife, or the woman with whom he had the child, the mother of the child, was so distraught that she said, basically, forget that stuff. Forget those natural ways that you talk about, because they don't apply in this circumstance. So that's an interesting piece. And then I thought about what you were talking when you were speaking of the drop of white blood and the mixing of the races. And I thought about New Orleans culture with the octoroons, and they created a whole social structure around men spending time with women that had been in that, and that had bloodlines intermixed within African bloodlines. And then I thought about, of course, the white mice, because you mentioned the mouse, or at least in my mind, the mouse came up. How even when they do scientific experiments, they don't use mice in their natural state. I don't know where they get white mice from. I've never seen one, in etc. So the point is that this manipulation, this social experimentation is going on all the time, and it manifests in all these different places, from the Tuskegee experiment to some of the other things that are still impacting how we interact with each other. Whether or not we trust the medical community. Right now, there's a big debate on whether or not people should take the vaccine. Well, you have people within the African American community, they've seen the ill effects of experimentation. They don't see it as safe, and they may not take it. Ms. Cabore, would you care to respond? I know I kind of took the points that Dr. Harris made and went in other directions. You can come back to the text itself if you care to.
So those some of those things that you were saying, they resonate with me as well. Just dealing with some of the challenges of even just something simple as a vaccine is amazing that we have such this same challenges here of this kind of distrust. And it just kind of also made me think of how a lot of times we struggle with as African Americans with and male and female relationships, just some of the challenges, and then some of the challenges of even more aware of it now with the vice president in office, and how we view where if an African American male is with a Caucasian female versus how if an African American female is with a Caucasian male too. Just kind of the feelings that come up within our community about just that thing right there. It just kind of made me think about that and the challenges we have with dealing with that, and being able to address those issues too.
Wow. Thank you so much. And Ms. Cabore, as we think about the vaccine, you know, in Wilmington, Sandra and and it's very interesting. No matter, you know, we can have more degrees than a thermometer, but we still are who we are. And I really, you know, I'm a pretty scientific, pretty educated person. But I have to say, when the vaccine was first released, my first mind was, no, I'm gonna wait because I'm gonna see how it impacts other people
First,
first. And you know, and that mind did come up, you know, because the impact of the virus has been what, like 3 times more impactful on Black people. And you know, that thought did cross my mind. It's like, you know, if the virus is already killing us, and then the white people are going to give us a vaccine, who said that might not help the process? You know, and so this paradigm that we live in, no matter how much education, how much success we have, is still there. And I had to really give myself a reality check. One of Sandra's best friends died. The neighbor on the block died. And my very best friend got the virus. And I mean, I watched him go through it. And I'm like, you know what? You know, I know they've done a lot of terrible stuff to us, but, and I, you know, it's interesting how we have to have a validation point. My validation point was this. I said, well, you know what? If it's good enough for President Obama, it's good enough for me.
I'll take it. Right.
I went on it. We got our shots. We've had them both, you know, and I'll say to the world, we feel fine. I also just in that moment, you know, I've listened to some of my younger Black folks, and I almost feel it's disrespectful when other people not diminish it. You know, I was on a thread on Facebook, and some of my friends, you know, and they were basically saying the virus is a hoax and it's this and that, and you don't let them take your temperature and all. And I said, you know, I really wanted to speak out there and say, well, Sandra's best friend died. We saw her January 5th, she was fine. And by February 15th, she was dead, you know? And so at least acknowledge that this thing is happening. So anyway, I won't rant on about that, but I thank you so much for all that you've shared, Ms. Cabore.
That's a good point. I think, Miss, did you have something else you wanted to say, Miss Cabore? I'm looking for comments from our audience members as well. Feel free to share some questions with us. So, Dr. Harris, when you say in the text, you actually make a point and you say, I want to read it correctly here. You raise this point. You say the key is, earlier we talked about the non-economic good of the horse and the Negro in the natural state. So what then is it that there's no economic good generally, or no economic good for the dominant culture, that they figure out how to be economically, you know, because economics is a part of life, that they figure out how to be economically effective? But like, I know people, they talk about living off the grid, you know, just like you see these movies or about people that they decide they're going to live in Alaska, they're going to live off the grid. What do you think of that notion of people in their natural state not being economically, for any economic good in the current economic structure? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we must go. The reason Black people were brought to America, you know, one big difference between the other immigrants and Black Americans is the other immigrants came here seeking a better life. Okay? That was their mindset. Okay? When Africans were brought to America, they were not brought here to integrate in with the system. They were brought here simply for the economic reason to provide labor, free labor, for the people in control. And so when we say that in the natural state was not to be a slave, was not to be living under the control of somebody else. And so in order for white Americans to enslave Black Americans, they had to take them out of that natural state. If you enslaved a white man, you'd have to do the same thing, take him out of his natural state. And so our natural state, we're just like everybody else. We want to live, we want to be happy, we want to take care of our friends. It is not our natural state to want to work forever in a state of perpetual servitude. So it's the wording there. The of no economic value, it's of no economic value to the slave master who desired free labor. Where America has grown now is America has really shortchanged herself, because look at all the value that Black people, Black Americans have given to America, to the culture, to the science. Every time I see that movie, Hidden Colors? You know, every time you look at virtually any area in which Black people are permitted to operate in as freely as white people, we can excel just as they do.
Yes.
So the natural state is to be like everybody else, to be a human being, respectful, going for your goals, living your life. The unnatural state is to be enslaved, where somebody else totally controls your everything.
Interesting. Interesting. We're at the 2:00 hour, Dr. Harris, and we did quite a bit of reading today. I'm looking for comments from our audience, and I have yet to see any. Any questions, anyone out there? And while we are awaiting their questions, we'll prepare to depart this official part, as you like to do, Dr. Harris. Would
Yes.
you care for a closing comment, Miss Janet North Cabore?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to read for you today. This is a very well needed project and read discussion to kind of provide a reflection and then a guide to how we can move forward and get over some of the hurdles that we have, huge hurdles that we have, and be stronger as a unit, as African Americans, as a community, and as America as a whole. So again, thank you so much for inviting me, and very happy to have been a part of this.
Well, we greatly appreciate you. We thank you so much. You've added so much to the conversation. Thank you so much. We're at the end of our program. Thanks, Dr. Rogers. We're at the end of our program, and what we normally do, those of you who have registered for the webinar, we now have a live real-time discussion. So those of you who are watching on Facebook or Instagram, please go and register so that you can get on the live webinar, and that is www.thebigread.net. You can go there and register. It's free. You get a free ebook version of the 12 Universal Laws of Success. But more than that, you become a part of the webinar and you can participate. Like, we're going to end our live broadcast now, but we're going to have some discussions afterwards. So thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to go and read, go and register www.thebigread.net. Thank you so much on Facebook and on Instagram. We're going to wrap up now, and we'll continue our live discussion with our valuable participants and readers.
Exactly. So, Ms. Cabore, if you could stay with